Good afternoon. Welcome to today's virtual event on COVID-19 disinformation and the 2020 election. I am Lawrence Norden, Director of the Election Reform Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. The Brennan Center is a nonpartisan law and policy institute affiliated with the NYU School of Law, and we are very grateful to be producing this program in partnership with Foreign Affairs magazine, which reports on international relations and U.S. foreign policy and is published by the Council on Foreign Relations, as well as NYU's John Bradamus Center, which is dedicated to civil debate on politics, public policy, and other major issues facing our world. Today, our panel will discuss the threat posed by pandemic-related mis- and disinformation to our democracy. This fall's elections, of course, need to be well organized, accurate, and transparent. But just as importantly for the legitimacy of our democracy, Americans must broadly agree that their outcome represents a true expression of the will of the people. Disinformation spread by domestic or foreign actors seeking to weaponize rumors and conspiracy theories to suppress participation is, of course, particularly worrisome. Unfortunately, solving the problem of disinformation on social media is far from easy. How do we distinguish disinformation, deliberate, erroneous propaganda, from mere misinformation or mistake? In taking action against disinformation, how do we ensure that legitimate speech is protected? And what is the appropriate role for government, social media companies, and civil society in combating disinformation that may harm our democracy? These questions are not theoretical, and how we choose to answer them may have a direct impact on elections this fall. Our distinguished guests today can help us navigate them. Joining us this afternoon is Laura Rosenberger, the Director of the Alliance for Securing Democracy and a Senior Fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Welcome, Laura.
Thanks, Larry. Glad to be here.
My colleague, Ian Vandewalker at the Brennan Center is Senior Counsel in our Democracy Program, where he works to address the influence of money in politics and foreign interference in U.S. elections. Hi, Ian.
Hi, good to talk to you.
And Ángel Díaz is counsel also in the Brennan Center in our Liberty and National Security Program. His work focuses on the intersection of technology with civil rights and civil liberties. Hello, Ángel.
Hi, good to be here.
Finally, I'm going to turn this program over to our moderator, Daniel Kurtz-Phelan, the executive editor of Foreign Affairs magazine.
Great, thanks so much, Larry, and thanks to the Brennan Center and the Bradamus Center for joining with Foreign Affairs to do this event today. I should also note Larry has done a couple of good pieces for Foreign Affairs in recent months, including one a couple of months ago called How to Vote in the Pandemic, so I encourage you to check that out. He is not, in fact, a panelist, but it adds a lot to the conversation and what we'll get to over the course of the next hour. I would also recommend a couple of pieces that Laura has done over the past several months, including one called China's Coronavirus Information Offensive that, again, addresses a lot of what we will talk about today. Before jumping into our discussion, I want to note for participants that all of you listening can ask questions that we'll get to a bit later in the discussion. To share your questions for the panel, please type them into the Q&A box. We will take as many as we can over the course of this discussion, and you can start getting those questions in the queue right away, and we'll get to them a bit later on. But for now, let me jump right into the discussion with the panelists. All of you have been tracking disinformation and following this issue for some time, and you've also been thinking about election security in various ways for a long time before the pandemic hit and really supercharged a lot of the fears and dynamics that you've been paying attention to. So I want to start with a kind of definitional question and an attempt to establish context a bit. First of all, how do you define disinformation? If we try to get at that definitional question that Larry raised, what makes something disinformation as opposed to just a politician's lies or a scammer's hoax or something else? And second, how has the particular swath of the disinformation landscape that you've tracked for a long time changed since March, since the pandemic really hit? Let's start with Laura, who obviously follows the international dimension of this.
Great, thanks, Dan, and thanks, Larry. It's really great to be with all of you and with Ian and Ángel here. It's a great topic, very timely. So, Dan, I think it's a really important question, and I would say, for me, disinformation is essentially, I'd associate myself with the way Larry described it. It's deliberately false information. And so you have sort of two different pieces to it. One is a content-based true false, and the other is an intention-based, right, deliberate. But I should stipulate that that is not the term I tend to use to describe the vast majority of what I observe. So I tend to talk about information manipulation. And as you noted, Dan, most of my work really looks at this issue in the context of geopolitics. I look largely at nation states and how they and their proxies are using various kinds of information tools in order to manipulate public discourse. And so I believe that disinformation is one tactic in a broader information manipulation toolkit that we see actors using. So I'll talk about it in that frame. On your second question about sort of how it's changed, and we can probably unpack this in more detail throughout the discussion, I think that we've seen two things, at least again, talking about international actors. One is a significant rise in China's prominence in this space, taking on a much more assertive and aggressive role in manipulating the information space in order to exercise power and influence to essentially to its own ends and goals. And in this case, it's sort of deflecting blame from itself and portraying itself as a model to the rest of the world. The other is that I do think, if we'd been having this conversation, before the coronavirus pandemic, I would have told you that most of what we see in the information manipulation space is actually not disinformation. That's a very small portion of what we actually see. In the coronavirus crisis, as we've seen in other crises, it's a really ripe opportunity for deliberate misleading information for those who seek to profit or gain power from it in one way or another. That includes nation states like China. That includes, just innovative entrepreneurial bad actors. But we have seen a significant amount of disinformation, and in the China context in particular, that's been about the origin of the virus and trying to spread alternative theories about the origin. So we could go, there's additional trend lines I could list, but I'll sort of leave it with those two to start us off with.
Great, thank you. Ian, let's go to you next for both the definitional question, but also what you've seen in the domestic space as you've tracked these issues over the past few months.
Right. So I think, there's the textbook definitions that you've all talked about, and I tend to agree that what we're concerned about in the democracy context, in the voting rights context, is this intentional spread of information, which might, as Laura mentioned, be sort of straight up false, or might be a manipulation or a misleading use of true information, but for a political purpose. So in the democracy space, the purposes tend to be either directly related to elections, so something like the current government's response to the coronavirus has been fine, everything is fine, it's not a danger, you don't need to vote the incumbents out, right? Has an obvious, or even without the last part, has a sort of obvious political valence in terms of an upcoming election. But then also disinformation. Now we're seeing this massive sort of information, this is chaotic information. The World Health Organization calls an infodemic, right? This sort of chaotic information space where there's falsehoods and misleading things flying around, interacting with what's a long practice in the United States of voter suppression, which is when falsehoods are used to try to discourage or prevent people from voting. Not across the board, of course, but you try to prevent specific people from voting because you think they're going to vote for the guy that you don't want to win. So these things are now interacting in the 2020 election/pandemic space. Obviously, we're seeing, examples like people saying COVID has been found at the polls. Don't go to the polls if you're 65 and older. Right? This we saw in the primary, when the primary had boiled down to a contest between Bernie Sanders in Joe Biden. Obviously, there's a perception that Joe Biden's voters are older. So we saw people on Twitter saying, you know, this kind of lie about COVID as a way of trying to keep older voters away and therefore manipulate the electorate. So yeah, I'll stop there. Obviously, there's more on that.
Yeah, thank you. There's a lot to come back to as we get into go further into discussion. But for now, let's go to Ángel. Feel free to take issue or amend either of those definitions of disinformation. But would also be curious to hear you elaborate a bit on what you've seen in the tech space and on the tech platforms and how they've tried to manage this infodemic and kind of reckon with the new reality that we're all living in.
Yeah, I actually really like the use of information manipulation because it sort of captures a big swath of what I think people are concerned about. And I think one of the things that I'm interested in is how often we use terms like disinformation and misinformation to characterize way too much. The reality is that in a pandemic, misinformation will occur no matter what. And we are learning a lot about this virus and having conversations about it, some of which are perhaps more in good faith than others, but the space is changing and changing quickly. And so I think that it's important to keep in mind that while there are serious concerns around state-sponsored efforts to mislead the public, whether that's from a foreign state or within domestically, there are also just folks that are trying to have a conversation about their health and their concerns around whether what the government is telling them or what media is telling them is fully accurate. And having an understanding of where the harm lies is, I think, something that platforms in particular have been struggling with, but also have embraced as something that's very different. So when we're seeing things that have changed between before and now, I think that the platforms have taken, one, a more unified approach in trying to get this problem under control. And they've deployed a number of different tactics that folks in civil society have been asking them to do in a variety of other contexts for many years. So there is an approach that updates their platform policies to capture a broader swath of harmful content. There are the use of automated tools, and also importantly, warning that those tools are clunky and they're going to get things wrong, and warning that we can't rely on them to be the fix for this. There have also been a lot of efforts to promote, beyond just whether content should stay up or stay down, other things that platforms can do to help keep people informed. So that could take the form of a knowledge panel at a homepage, returning certain search results that elevate authoritative sources. But it also looks at things like downranking, demonetizing channels that are breaking the rules and things like that. So I think we're in an interesting space where we're kind of testing a lot of different solutions that folks have been calling for many years.
Thank you a lot also to follow up on there, but I want to turn a little bit more directly to your fears as we head towards November and this election year. You obviously have this kind of uniquely troubling mix of issues related to disinformation and foreign interference and voting rights and the integrity of the democratic process and health and so much else. I think it's easy for those of us who don't follow this every day the way you all do to concoct various nightmare scenarios about what the next few months are going to look like and what November is going to look like. But it would be useful, I think, to have each of you kind of put a finer point on what you're worried about. What are you worried about in the information space, in the voting rights space, and we can turn then after that to the kind of question of what we do about it. But let's try to be a little bit more concrete about these fears. Ian, why don't we start with you, since you alluded to some of this initially.
Right. So the typical sort of voter suppression disinformation, right? This has happened for decades. People used to put, Xerox a sign and put it on a telephone pole in African-American neighborhoods trying to get people to not vote. And they're doing the same version of this now on social media with, in some cases, sophisticated targeting tools. In some cases, it's not sophisticated at all. So the danger with this, and this gets to some of the things that Ángel was talking about, is that kind of voter deception tends to happen in the days or hours before an election. And that makes responding to it very difficult, right? If something goes viral in the sort of the Monday before election day, it's hard both for corrective information to get around to people who have seen the false information, and it's hard for the platforms to do whatever response that they're going to do, if they're going to take it down, or if they're going to push out corrective information themselves, simply because a post can go to millions of people very fast. It's not, it always baffles me, but Facebook apparently actually has a hard time telling who has seen a given piece of content, despite their technical expertise with everything else. And as Ángel mentioned, there's the problem of false positives, right? If you try to act fast, if you try to use AI, if you try to use machine learning, maybe you end up silencing completely legitimate voices who are not trying to deceive people who are trying to alert somebody about a piece of false information. Or there's these sort of ambiguous areas like ICE is at the polls. ICE is at the polls could be used as voter suppression to try and suppress immigrant communities and related ethnic or language communities from voting, but it could also be used by immigrant activists to protect their communities from law enforcement. So what's the intent, what's the effect? All of these things are very complicated, and in cases where you're dealing with it in a matter of hours, it's obviously a big challenge.
Ángel, anything you would add to those particular fears or others?
So I think that to sort of be the sort of civil liberties person in the room, I think that there's a lot of concern around what free expression looks like online. And there is a really big need, I think, to balance how we approach free expression with other harms that are very real. So in the context of COVID-19, there's a pandemic. People's lives could literally be at risk. In the context of voting, we have similar concerns around people's ability to express themselves at the polls and be able to meaningfully participate in elections. At the same time, there is a big concern that whether it's domestic misinformation or state-sponsored foreign interference, a lot of the things that are being touched on are issues that are really important to Black and brown communities. It's police brutality. It is our inability to stop killing Black people. It is a lot of things that are active and live that are being discussed very widely on the internet. And I worry that if we start using more and more automated tools that aren't really particularly sophisticated at understanding how any of us talk, but particularly how communities of color use the internet, we have a higher risk of false positives. So these are kind of things that we're concerned about, but they have to be balanced against the reality that there are real harms that we're trying to prevent.
Can I press you to say a bit more about the free speech concerns and how we should think about this? If Mark Zuckerberg happened to be joining these panels, I think he would probably raise some of the challenges or the concerns with Facebook executives making these questions about free speech. So curious how you address those kinds of concerns and what you think the right way to get this balance, to strike this balance is.
Yeah, I think I would have a different approach to free expression than Mark Zuckerberg would have. I think the way we're talking about the other harms, it's very easy to sort of have free speech stand for doing nothing at all and just having a free-for-all in terms of conversations that happen online. And I think that that is potentially dangerous and doesn't actually engage with the reality of both the information sphere and information as warfare, as Laura will speak more eloquently about, but also sort of the existence of ongoing harms that happen to journalists when they try to report information and get harassed, to the way in which people are showing up to sort of potentially counter protests that have deadly consequences, like that are being organized through Facebook groups. There are a lot of sort of tangible harms that are coming out of what's happening on Facebook. And I think that an approach to free expression that isn't meaningfully grounded in the realities of what racial discrimination looks like in this country is just fundamentally incomplete. And I think these platforms oftentimes lack, I should say, the civil rights auditor for yesterday agreed that they oftentimes lack appropriate civil rights background to really meaningfully protect free expression. And the First Amendment is meant to protect groups that don't necessarily have the same power dynamics as others. So if you are not meaningfully protected marginalized groups, you are not actually standing up for free expression.
And Laura, what, as you track Russian and Chinese efforts and those potentially other actors worries you heading into November?
Well, I worry a lot about the same things that Ian outlined, so I won't repeat those. And that's not to say I don't worry about the things that Ángel outlined as well. But my sort of biggest nightmare scenario, and the way I think that the trend lines over the past few months have exacerbated this is. Elections are an institution that are based on trust. People trust the integrity of the outcome. People need to have faith that the process was fair, that it was free from interference, and that they can believe in the outcome of the election as being, in fact, what happened, representing what happened. And right now, we have so much confusion in the information ecosystem. We have so many people who are either deliberately trying to mislead people, to undermine their faith in institutions. But we also have, as Ian and Larry has written about as well, we've had significant changes to how people are going to vote in November. We've seen some of that in the primaries. We've seen some of that getting ready for November. And if we think back for just one moment, before the pandemic, actually, to the Iowa caucuses, where there was an app that was used for reporting results that malfunctioned. And in fact, there was no problem with integrity. There had been no hacking. The app just simply didn't work. But thank goodness the caucus system had a paper backup to record all of the people who had caucused for which candidates. But it just took a longer time to report. And we've seen some of these delays occurring in other primaries as well. And in the Iowa case, we spent 24 hours of people sort of freaking out about, had there been a hack? Was the system rigged? Was something, malign happening? And even just 2 weeks ago, I'm blanking now on which primary it was, but one of the headlines in a major newspaper declared that the chaos we had seen with the delayed results was a, indicator of what we were going to see in November. And I took issue with the equating of chaos, of a delay in reporting results with chaos, because as long as, let's take the time we need to count the votes, right? Let's make sure that we have integrity. And all of us and reporters and candidates are just going to need to be a little more patient. But what really worries me right now is that we are so primed to question what's happened and to worry about whether there has been malfeasance that my biggest nightmare scenario is that a nefarious actor, Russia in particular, I could see wanting this play because their real goal is to discredit American democracy, to basically come in and say, look at all of this chaos and everything that's happening here. How can you trust this? How can you trust that? And surely we'll point to and find different instances of something where people are saying something went sideways, largely probably without any cause. But to really discredit the outcome so that by the time we get results, people will not believe that they are actually representing what happened in the election.
Laura, have you seen, as you've tracked all of this, changes in Russian tactics or objectives from 2016 to now? And is there anything that China has learned from Russia that you think is particularly concerning as we head towards November?
Yeah, it's a great question. So Russian tactics have changed significantly since 2016. And, without going into tremendous detail, I'll just kind of keep it basic. I mean, one is that, in fact, they actually just need to do a lot less. We're doing so much to ourselves in terms of spreading disinformation and in terms of spreading conspiracy theories, in terms of divisive content and questioning institutions. I mean, we are just giving them the best material that we could possibly do. So a lot of what we see is much more amplification of existing content that is American generated, which has different kinds of implications for speech, kind of getting to some of the points that Ángel was raising. That's point one. Point two is some of their tactics are far more precision guided, if you will. So they're less like carpet bombing and more sort of precision targeted tactics. And some of that depends on, or is a variable based on, we think, the fact that we see a little bit less activity from Internet Research Agency type trolls and more from assets that appear to be connected to Russian intelligence, particularly the GRU, its military intelligence. where they're really targeting specific communities, recruiting activists or individuals in communities to carry their message for them. Often unwittingly, you know, the activists or people don't necessarily know the message they're carrying is coming from a sort of Russian source. We've seen the outsourcing of all kinds of you know, information laundering tactics through proxies. We've learned a lot by watching what Russia's done in certain African contexts and in Ukraine as well. You know, one of the more interesting developments is earlier this year, the New York Times broke a story with CNN and others looking at, actually maybe CNN that broke it, but in any case, the story about how there was, you know, the Russians essentially outsourced a troll farm to a nonprofit that they had sort of stood up in 2 African countries to be doing some of their IRA-like activity. So those have been the biggest changes in tactics. I would say, you know, in intent, you know, it really remains the same. It's discrediting the U.S. It's discrediting democracy. It's you know, pulling on our divisions. But you know, the biggest change is in many ways that we just see so much less of it in the covert space because they just don't need to be doing as much of that. In terms of what China's learned, you know, they're certainly trying out the covert activity, and just last month, Twitter took down 170,000 accounts connected to Chinese official assets that were spreading disinformation and other sorts of coordinated inauthentic behavior on the platform. But a lot of what we've seen, I think, China learn is, you know, how to tap into existing information ecosystems. So we now see Chinese official actors, as well as its state media, engaging heavily with conspiracy websites that have featured prominently in the Russian information ecosystem to date, right? We've seen them using coordinated tactics to spread multiple conflicting narratives about the coronavirus, as I mentioned earlier, in, you know, play that looked really similar to what we saw Russia do after the MH17 shoot down or the poisoning of Sergei Skripal. So I think they're learning specific plays, but the other thing I think that gets missed sometimes in terms of what I think they're learning is they're learning how to use these platforms against us, how to actually work the infrastructure of the platforms. So for instance, there's been a lot of discussion about whether China's very negative messaging about the coronavirus, about the US, about Europe has backfired on them. Well, that's just looking at the effect of the narrative itself. What that's not looking at is the fact that those negative trolling messages are what gets the highest engagement on the platforms. This is what the platforms are wired for, this sort of viral content. And these accounts are actually growing their audience significantly by engaging in this sort of conspiratorial, very negative trolling behavior in a way that, again, looks very Russian.
Ángel and Ian, I want to linger on something that you've all alluded to, just the kind of mechanics of running an election in a time of a pandemic. You know, there's a kind of way that we think we will have to hold an election depending on exactly where things are in terms of outbreaks and case levels as we get to November. But what do you see as the kind of key steps that we need to take to ensure the integrity of the process and just the ability of people to vote in a very straightforward way? And what concerns you in terms of the way information manipulation could undermine that? I guess, you know, vote by mail seems like the obvious one, but there are probably others out there. Ángel, anything that you would have people focus on in that regard?
I think this is actually a better one for Ian to answer since he's in our democracy.
Right. Yeah, as you mentioned, vote by mail is going to be important to give people that option to not go in person to a place where the virus might spread and to just reduce the loads. We'll always need in-person voting for a lot of reasons, but so vote by mail has to increase dramatically. The problem from a disinformation perspective is that one of the Twitter accounts with the most followers on Twitter is currently engaged in a massive campaign of saying that vote by mail is fraudulent. It is inherently fraud. It yields fraud. There's massive fraud happening, even though, you know, President Trump has voted by mail. Lots of states use vote by mail. Now, the calculus, presumably, I don't claim to know what's in Trump's mind, but presumably he thinks vote by mail is good for Democrats, and therefore increased use of it will be bad for him and his party in the election. That, according to the actual evidence, seems to be false. But the issue from the sort of disinformation changing people's behavior perspective is that it does seem to be that this constant campaign, which is echoed in right-wing infrastructure, it's echoed by individual, just regular people's accounts on social media. It's echoed by neighbors talking to neighbors. We've seen examples of. Means that the use of vote by mail is actually going down, which is literally voter suppression, including by Republican constituencies. So that's changing who's going to vote and how they're going to vote and how dangerous that might be from a public health perspective. And then the other thing, of course, is that this is seeding a potential narrative, as Laura was talking about, that no matter what happens, once we do get the result of the election in November or December, that whoever loses, especially if it's the person who's been seeding this narrative, can say that was rigged. That's not the real outcome. The real outcome is that I win. And right. So, and it's not crazy to say that Trump will do this, because he literally did it in 2016 when he lost the popular vote. He said that there were, there were busloads of people in Vermont or whatever. He just makes stuff up. So, I mean, disinformation is already tricky because it's essentially rumor, and rumor is this inherent human thing that people do, and it's made very easy by social media. But when it's led by leaders, people at the top, people who have the biggest mouthpieces, it becomes extremely hard to counteract, as we've seen both in the public health context with untruths about how dangerous COVID is and what we should be doing to respond to it, and in this direct logistics of elections. So how do we vote? What's safe? What's fraudulent? What leads to rigged elections?
Is there anything anticipating the likely uncertainty and attempts to sow uncertainty in the aftermath of a vote? Is there anything that people can do now to try to prepare to head off that possibility?
Right. That's a great question. We're recommending that what everybody needs to do is get the right answer from the authoritative source. So in the case of elections, this is election officials. And election officials actually tend to have much higher sort of trust ratings than national politicians, even though they're obviously less visible. A lot of people don't know who their Secretary of State or election official is. But, these officials all have some kind of public organ, a website, a social media account, and they need to be pushing out not just correct information now, but pushing out themselves as the source of the correct information, right? So making those connections with local journalists, making connections with communities that are likely to be attacked by voter suppressive disinformation. And the other way too, those communities and those journalists need to be knowing who's the right, ahead of time, who's the right person to talk to get the answer of what's the vote by mail deadline? When do things have to be postmarked by? Are the polls going to be open? We saw these things changing at the last minute in some of the primaries. Hopefully that doesn't happen in November. But if it does, we need a sort of communications infrastructure that includes government officials, media, journalists, community groups, and the campaigns and parties themselves to be all making sure that voters are getting correct information, especially as needed to correct campaigns of disinformation about, vote by text, which is false, or don't go to this polling place because it's closed when that's false.
That leads me to what I think will be the last question for me before we turn to questions from the audience. Again, if you do have a question, you can go to the Q&A function and type it in, and we will get to as many of those as we can. But first, I want to ask each of you to tell us what the key policy steps that should be taken at this point to try to preempt some of these fears might be. That can be from federal government, local government, private sector actors. I realize that in most cases, some of this stuff should have been happening for years, and a few months before election is not exactly the time to address some of these problems. But if you could, go into Facebook or DHS or some other institution and make some change now, what would it be? Ángel, let's start with you on this one.
Yeah, so I'll start with something that maybe the platforms can do, and then turn to something a little bit different. I think that one of the good opportunities about this pandemic is that we basically have a really rich case study in what works and what doesn't work. We have had platforms that have been using automated tools to take down content. It'd be great to know how often they got it wrong, how often people were appealing, how often that decision had to be overturned. We also have seen the deployment of knowledge panels, how often people engage with that. If you put up a warning sign that says something is incorrect information, what does that look like? What does that do to the distribution of false information on the platform? These are really important things that would be useful for not only the platforms themselves to look at, but for academics to get to study, for legislators to have an understanding of whether these proposals actually work before they start to pass potential regulation of these platforms. There's a lot that we can learn from what's happened during this pandemic in terms of how to create platforms that have healthier discourse. But I think that when it comes to preventing sort of attacks on our democracy, I'll let my colleagues sort of go into other questions. I think that for me, I think we oftentimes need to look a little bit within and to think about what does it mean to have a president who's constantly promoting false information? What does it mean when we continue to kill Black people? What does it mean when we have the suppression of protests and calling everybody that's out there a looter? We are, as Laura said, we're making it so clear that all the things that are wrong with our democracy are ongoing. And the biggest thing that we can do is address those core problems, because that will help us in the long run.
Quick follow-up on the platforms. Have they been cooperative in working with government officials, with academics and others who are trying to figure this out? Do you think you're getting the kind of access information that you and others need to start doing some of that work?
I think that the platforms have improved over time in terms of the kinds of data that they give over to civil society and to academics. It could still be very much improved in a variety of ways in terms of what are the kinds of things that are being removed. We've been very interested in, let's say, terrorist content for a long time and how that might be impacting the documentation of war crimes. We've been worried about whether that impacts Muslim American speech. We don't have access to what's in those databases. Similarly, I know a lot of our coalition partners are very interested in getting more granular access to ad libraries and how ads are being targeted. What are some of the algorithmically generated categories that are popping up? There's always much more to do, and I hope that this is an opportunity to actually improve how much access we get for researchers.
Laura, what would your key steps be?
So I'm going to build off of my nightmare scenario piece here, and I think that what I'd like to see is a really massive public education campaign that is both led by, and including key journalists and reporters about how we are likely to see the process of the November election unfold, and sort of building resilience in the electorate's mindset between now and then, both about being adaptive to changes and aware, and to Ian's point, this is absolutely critical, making sure there's authoritative sources out there and that people know who they are and that those sources are active. Like, I think there's often this misnomer of like, sure, we have official Secretary of State Twitter accounts that will, be active in the couple of days before the election. Like, fully misunderstands what social media actually is about. If your account hasn't been active and it's been dormant and you're not doing anything, nobody knows it's there, right? So you need to be running those strategies now. All those authoritative sources need to be out there laying expectations for people, helping to build resilience in the way they're thinking about things. And again, I think the media has to play a huge role here. And one of the things that we know from 2016 is that the media actually ended up being a megaphone for disinformation, right? And that's something that the Russians really used to their advantage. And I worry that there are certain plays in which we are still susceptible to the media potentially being in that same position. So I think that that's something that, again, we really need to bring in. We talk so much about social media, and I spend a lot of time talking about social media, and we need to do that. But the closer we get to the election, I think that our bigger megaphone voices in the traditional media space are even more critical in building that public resilience and setting expectations for people.
Have you, in that regard, seen media organizations learning from 2016 and taking steps to correct it?
There are plenty of media organizations who say they have learned things and who say the right things. But I'll point to a recent example. The Daily Beast actually had a fascinating expose about some fake personas that were actually created. This is out of the Middle East, but doing some of the same things that we saw happen in 2016 with these fake personas actually writing articles for media outlets and getting published. And these people don't exist. They are there solely to, covertly present a particular and often misleading viewpoint. And the fact that those checks still aren't in place, that somebody who doesn't exist, who isn't an American, can get placed in American, media outlets is a pretty disturbing thing to me. And I believe some of those voices were even then, cited in other reporting. And so that's just one example of a case where we still have not learned some of these really basic lessons of how we got burned 4 years ago.
Yeah, it's kind of a nightmare scenario for an editor to see those stories. Ian, anything you would add on policy steps right now?
Yeah, so I do think in terms of platforms, they need, as Ángel said at the outset, they need to better understand what they're talking about. They need to better understand the world of civil rights, the world of voting rights, the world of immigrant organizing, and how elections work. Right now, this is like a teeny tiny bit of what they do. And Facebook will brag about how it has 30,000 human reviewers, but they have, 2+ billion users. Like 30,000 is nothing, right? And that's worldwide, and that's across all of the content rules that they have. So, they're relying on AIs. They can't really do the job. They're relying on overworked human reviewers. And now that they've sent everybody home after COVID, their human reviewers have gone down. And the fact is, their model prefers scary rumors to bland truths. I mean, it's just inherent to going viral that a scary rumor is more likely to go viral than the Secretary of State saying, everything's fine or whatever. So that's a deeper problem with the sort of the social media platform model that that always comes up in these conversations, and I don't know the answer to. From the perspective of government, one of the things people often don't realize about the United States is we don't have an electoral system. We have 10,000 electoral systems because there are 10,000 local election jurisdictions. And each of those is trying to solve this problem, solve this disinformation problem, along with all the other problems, how to deal with COVID, how to print more vote by mail ballots at the same time, and every one of them is underfunded. So the federal government needs to massively put resources in the hands of the people who are actually running elections and are actually trying to defend against these disinformation attacks. And that, as I said before, and Laura alluded to, requires setting up an information infrastructure and a communications infrastructure, not on election night, not now, but 6 months ago. And making sure people know who to go to for correct information and protecting that infrastructure, because it's going to be attacked, right? There's going to be hacks. There's going to be spoofs where I set up, I can set up a Twitter account that says, California Secretary of State, where I spelled California slightly wrong. And if I'm a savvy user, I can get more followers than the real California Secretary of State because they're doing boring stuff. And then I just, sort of Twitter along quietly. And then the night before election night, I say something completely false about what has happened. And a million people see that and nobody sees the response by the real Secretary of State. So building in that resiliency and those defenses to the kinds of dirty tricks that people are going to play is, again, essential to be doing now.
It sounds like what we really need is a program that takes a bunch of social media savvy, Gen Zers sitting in their parents' houses right now and assigns them to Secretary of State's offices in the next 3 months.
It couldn't hurt.
A question from an unidentified member of the audience that picks up on something that Ángel was raised a bit earlier. What should we make of the fact that the #1 purveyor of disinformation on COVID, voting, et cetera, isn't a foreign adversary, but the President of the United States? Should social media companies take additional steps to hold Trump's speech to a different standard than, say, a Russian bot? We've obviously seen Twitter and Facebook handle this in different ways in recent months, but what's the right way to handle it? Ángel, let's go to you first.
Yeah, so another one of the things that has changed during COVID is that Twitter has taken steps to remove tweets by the presidents of Venezuela and Brazil when they shared misinformation about various remedies or cures to COVID. And to their credit, they have also placed some warning signs on tweets by the president. Ultimately, yes, if you're really going to meaningfully try to protect voters or protect the election, you have to be able to take some sort of a stand against someone who has a much bigger platform than a random bot that's just retweeting what's already out there. There are obviously public interest concerns that need to be balanced. I think that a warning that says this is incorrect information, that we think it's important for the public to be able to see, the kinds of limits that Twitter put on some of Trump's tweets, like not allowing you to sort of retweet with additional commentary and things like that. There are sort of ways to practically sort of try to counterbalance misinformation that go beyond simply quickly removing every single thing that an elected official says, because there is a lot of interest in understanding what our elected officials do. However, unlike in media where journalists have the opportunity to say that this claim is unverified or have other people respond to it, when you just give somebody a megaphone and don't actually have an opportunity to attach any editorial things next to it, you are essentially inflaming or just giving them more of a platform.
Sorry, Laura and Ian, anything you would add to that?
I would just note as a broad principle that, from the perspective that I look at these issues from, right, which is the geopolitical one, and I largely look at how authoritarian regimes are using disinformation and information manipulation to undermine and weaken democracy. And what's very clear is that we cannot win in the contest for the information space and pushing back on what authoritarian regimes are doing and building resilience at home if democratic principles aren't guiding our response. So we need to be doubling down on democracy and every form of it in how we respond to disinformation, not in any way adopting the tactics that are being used against us.
Ian, anything you would add? Yeah, I just think that it's scary to me that, Trump has been treated differently. It's been essentially exempt from the rules for a long time. And Twitter sort of had this very mild, like, he posted something false on Twitter, said, maybe think about this. And he screams censorship, and he writes an executive order saying, we're gonna completely change the way the industry is regulated. We're gonna repeal aspects of the Communication Decency Act, right? This gets to what Laura was talking about. This is a scary environment of this sort of open retaliation against a media company in clear violation of the First Amendment is this knee-jerk reaction by the president. And the fact is the president has been good at working the refs on social media for a long time. And I think the companies need to grow a backbone. And as you both have said, have a response that's consistent, that's measured, that's transparent, and that is in accord with deeper democratic principles and protection of marginalized communities, which is not what's happening right now.
Let me try to combine a couple of questions on related points. I think, Ángel, this is probably best directed at you, but others should answer as well. What role should fact-checking companies play in moderating or correcting social media content suspected of being false? And then a bit more broadly, how and why should people and users have faith that the processes that these companies put in place are being carried out in a fair and nonpartisan and accurate way? Is there enough transparency? What can be done to ensure faith in the integrity of the process that the platforms put in place?
Yeah, I think platforms are at a tough spot when it comes to trust right now, and have quite a ways to go to rebuild that trust. Certainly being more transparent, being more accountable, being consistent in how they apply the rules would go a long way. To the question of what role fact checkers should play, ultimately they are helping. From what it seems like, they are providing corrective information. They are checking things that are potentially incorrect. The question sort of becomes, what's Facebook's role or YouTube's role, to the extent they use them as well, to compensate these folks for basically doing outsourced content moderation for them? There may be a one-time grant or a two-time grant, but the money that gets paid to these people that are doing a very difficult job in an information space that's changing by the minute, I think that it's likely that they're not being paid enough. In terms of the concern around whether what the fact checkers are doing is fair, that's a difficult question. I think that when Facebook set up its third-party fact-checking system, they worked with the Poynter Institute, and they wanted every organization to go through a vetting process that would establish, for lack of a better word, like good faith efforts to meaningfully fact-check. At the same time, there has been, on the right, folks who think that the Associated Press is a biased organization that can't be trusted to meaningfully fact-check. At the same time, when there were what folks might consider far-right blogs that also got the ability to fact-check, there was a lot of concern about what was being taken down. I think that Laura actually brought up a really important point that I want to sort of elevate in this context, which is that the media also has a role to play in how they present information. And so ultimately, I think that both sides are going to be really upset with content being rated as false. And I suspect that more often than not, one of the things that's the most misleading are how headlines are created. And I think that if you could just meaningfully understand that a lot of people are just going to read a headline, and if you could sort of create a world where headlines are a little bit less inflammatory and more reflective of what's actually in the story, both sides might be a little bit better served. But it's just one of those things where I think the media's responsibility oftentimes gets sort of left to the side when we focus on the platforms.
Yeah, that certainly rings true. Being in a nonprofit media organization, the economic incentives are so misaligned at this point. Ian and Laura, what would you add to Angel's answer?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo the resources point on fact check. You can't have too much fact checking. There are definitely viewpoint issues, but honestly, other than sort of people screaming at the ends of the spectrum, I think there's actually broad agreement on accurate fact-checking organizations. But fact-checking is hard, and it's slower than just making something up that sounds scary and getting people to share it. And as Angel mentioned, it's, Facebook is sort of relying on free labor here. I mean, there are proposals out there. I'm not currently proposing this. I'm mentioning other people proposing it. That the social media platforms should have an obligation to create essentially like a public television of social media, and have a deeply resourced set of voices that's in the network that is constantly saying, here's what's real, here's what's broadly agreed upon, and that those voices are pushed against the sort of dangerous disinformation.
Laura?
Yeah, I would just note a couple of things. I think everything that's been said is spot on. But a few additional things. One, I think there's real limitations to fact checking, and there's there's been a lot of different studies about the degree to which fact checking is efficacious, and in some settings it may actually reinforce people's underlying beliefs. And so there's that piece of it. But the other piece of it is, again, going back earlier to what we were talking about, right, is Ian was just alluding, I mean, a lot of this isn't about pure disinformation. Fact checking is useful when it's disinformation or misinformation, but when the content is misleading in another way, when it's the behavioral aspect, when it's the manipulation happening in a different way that's not content based, fact checking doesn't really get at it. So I see that as a very, very limited approach to how we think about this. What I do think is really important, and Ángel was alluding to some of this, social media and the digital information space in general strips away a lot of the context cues that people are accustomed to getting that help them assess information through a critical thinking lens. And I think what we need to be doing are sort of, and seeing from the platforms, there are sort of two principles that should really guide what they do. One is really providing much greater transparency into why people are seeing the information they are, giving them a lot more context to enable that assessment that people then can better evaluate the information that they're getting. And the other piece related to transparency is I think we need to have a much more transparent sense of what the platforms themselves are actually doing in terms of enforcement, right? I mean, they all have these transparency reports that they put out that cover certain different things, but we really don't know, for instance, why certain, what content they're choosing to demote, right? We don't know what content they're choosing to promote. We don't know what content they are choosing, across a whole host of different pieces. Like Facebook has this, God love it, newsworthiness exemption to basically every one of their policies. Twitter has a similar one, although it's less of like a, hole you can drive a truck through. But the newsworthiness exemption has never actually really been clarified in any meaningful way of what it means. And so like even really big things that you would think are like no-goes have a newsworthiness exemption. And so that's where I think we need transparency in a fundamentally different way, both for users and in terms of holding the platforms accountable for what they're actually doing.
One last set of questions, and this again gets at questions from a number of people. Do you see models that other countries or other governments have tried that are useful in the US context in terms of combating information manipulation around the election? And specifically, do you see benefit to a France-style media or advertising blackout in the United States in the run-up to elections? Laura, let's start with you on this one.
Sure. I'll start with the last piece of that, which is that I don't think a France-style media blackout is ever going to be possible in the United States. I mean, I defer to my legal expert colleagues on the panel here, but I don't see any way that ever works under the First Amendment. But that being said, I do think there are a lot of lessons that we can be learning from other countries. I mean, we've not done nearly enough alliance coordination around this issue set. I mean, this administration is not doing nearly enough alliance coordination across most issues, but particularly in this area, there's so much more we could be learning from each other. France actually does have some other interesting things that they've done, in particular setting up some pretty robust mechanisms for government cooperation with civil society and really sort of giving civil society actors a much greater sort of platform and sort of information sharing between those two has been a pretty robust thing that I think we can learn from. Canada set up some really interesting mechanisms in advance of its elections last year, including some task forces across the government that brought together different people who don't normally sit together, working with the social media companies, working with civil society. There's examples from the Baltic states that have been dealing with, Russian malign influence for quite a long time in terms of building societal resilience. Countries like Sweden have some fascinating approaches as well. So there's a lot of different examples that we can be looking to, and my team's actually leading some work to actually build out and lift out some of those examples, because I do think that it's a great piece for us to be focusing much more on.
Great. Ian, and then Ángel, international examples you would point to.
Yeah, I mean, I do think, as Laura mentioned, some of the Baltic states have better media literacy sort of ideas than we do, right? So social media has rapidly become, I mean, especially even coronavirus, Facebook use has spiked. Most people are getting their news from Facebook. and yet nobody's really taught in this country how to, like the kinds of things Laura was talking about. How do you read a Facebook post? How do you read a headline? How do you figure out if this is true? How do you figure out if this is trustworthy? I mean, in Sweden, they're literally teaching grade school children those things. And those programs continue, and not just Sweden, but other countries. So I think we've turned into a country that for all kinds of political and business purposes does everything on social media, and lots of people just don't really know how to use it in a sort of epistemic truth building sense. So, you know, that's one thing. Obviously that's sort of hard to build up and hard to move. I think reliance on civil society in terms of, you know, fact-checking abilities and journalism and, you know, public media has been sort of hollowed out in this country. That should be expanded. You know, even as I say that, I hear the objection that, you know, creating more sort of government speech in this world of hyper-partisanship and failure of trust in institutions, right, that's going to get hijacked politically. But, you know, right now there's this sort of vacuum where the platforms are making money off of virality. The bad guys know how to use virality to hurt us and our institutions and our democracy. And there's a vacuum that needs to be filled with sort of responsible, resourced, fact-based information spreading.
Ángel?
Yeah, so I'll try to answer it in a sort of somewhat different way. I think that what Ian's pointing to in terms of how the platforms are set up and what they incentivize, Facebook likes to say that they sort of hold a mirror to society. And that's somewhat true. A lot of the bigotry and hatred and things that are in lies that are shared online existed before the internet and will exist afterwards. At the same time, all of these platforms have said that they're taking a stand against certain things when it comes to hate speech, when it comes to misinformation. And so if they're going to take a stand and apply these rules, they need to do it consistently, transparently, in an accountable way. One of the models that I think is interesting is, you know, Germany has a transparency regime that requires certain kinds of disclosures to be made by the platforms. Laura mentioned that the transparency reports are high level, you're kind of stuck trying to figure out what they mean. They've evolved over time and they're really slow, but ultimately they are selected by the platforms to show whatever they want. I mean, hate speech is a great example. When you say 90% of hate speech gets found by automated systems, what hate speech are you looking for? How do you define that? There is so much more that we could know. And I think that there comes to be a point where you really need mandatory transparency that is reflective of the things that we're actually looking for, and not just sort of how the platforms want to tell us particular bits of information. I will at the same time caution that there's some movements in the EU, let's say around the terrorist content regulation, that's contemplating removing content within an hour of it being found or something like that. There are a lot of wishful thinking when it comes to the use of algorithms. And I think that even though we have a very real problem with harmful content on the internet, we should really be careful when it comes to automating those issues by using algorithms that are very context blind and are most likely than not going to end up harming already marginalized communities.
I'm sorry not to have gotten to all the other questions that have come in, but to close, there have been a number of questions about what individuals can do to address some of this. And I would just note, you can sign up for vote by mail if you're in a state that allows it. You can tell your family and friends and your elected representatives that it matters, and you can complete your census form online at my2020census.gov. But with that, our thanks to our guests today, Laura Rosenberger from the Alliance for Securing Democracy, and Ian and Ángel from the Brennan Center, and also to Larry Norton from the Brennan Center. Again, thank you to both Brennan and the Bradema Center for partnering with Foreign Affairs today. Thanks so much, everyone.